Okay, so today's job will be to make this page alive. Basically, what we created last time was a mechanism for propagating from some fake data that we defined in app, some contents that represents a set of answers, okay, in our example. We put these buttons here. Last week we had words during these days. I just modified them so that the icons are shown using the React Bootstrap icons module. That's a library for that, but you can see that in the code. But basically these buttons do nothing, okay? They don't do anything because we didn't attach any behavior to them. So just to analyze how could we make some buttons work. For example, the easiest one is the delete button, okay? A delete button should destroy one of the rows that we have here in the answers. Of course, the answers can no longer, in this case, when we want to be able to modify all these values, they cannot be just stored into a constant variables inside the top level component, okay? So if we want something to evolve, we should store that into a state variable. So the first modification that I did, and then the rest we'll do together, is we had this, remember this fake question and fake answers objects. I created two state variables called questions and answers. Okay, two state variables like we learned last time. So question is the reference to the value, and set question is the function for updating it, and the same for answers. And I created the state by initializing it from the fake objects, so that these objects will not be used anymore except for the first initialization inside the state, okay? And the rest of the application will work on the state variables. So what I see is that in the question display and answer display, okay, I passed a property setting the question to the state variable question and the answer to the state variable answer. So we are not passing fake question or fake answers anymore, but the state variable, okay? So this is the first modification, so that we should be able, okay, in a way to, the application is the same, it behaves in the same way. All the components don't know anything about this change except the app component, okay? So for example, for the point of view of the answer display component, it just receives some props, some property that contain the value of an array of answers. That's it, okay? All the components below this one don't care, shouldn't care about where this value is coming from a constant, from a prop, from a state, or whatever else. Automatically React will re-render all the components below answer display, for example, whenever this state variable changed. Okay, so that's the first point. If we have a look at the component tree, what we see is that the state is in app. So in app we have these state variables, but the actions, the buttons, are much below. Okay, so we are here. The button here is inside an answer action buttons component that we created, which is in turn inside answer row, and so on and so on. So actually what we should be able to do is that to attach some behavior to this button down there in the component tree, so that it will modify the state that we put in app. Okay, of course we don't want to put the state anywhere else than in the app component, because this information, the state variables, are needed also, for example, for the question display. No, the question and answer display should share the view of the state. So if some information is needed both in question and in answer display, for showing different parts of the page, then the state must be defined at the higher component. So moving the state down is not an option. But actually the button is here. So how can we provide this capability? Well, we should let this button, or a click action on this button, be able to call a function that will delete a state variable. Deleting a state variable is only possible by calling set answers for changing the state. Yeah, the set answer function can modify the state. Okay, so what we do normally is to define a function in the component that defines the state for supporting the main actions, main modification actions on the state itself, and then pass this function down to the children component so that the button that needs it can call this function when the user clicks on it. So actually, we can define a function here inside the app component. Okay, we can define a function, maybe delete answer, something like that, which is a function, that modifies the state by deleting a specific answer. Of course, which answers to be deleted, we need to know. So maybe we take as an argument the ID of the answer. And then we will do something like set state, sorry, not set, set answers, with a new set of answers that don't include the ID anymore. Okay, I cannot write this morning. Why a new set? Because a state variable, okay, answers, the state variable answer is a reference to an array. But we cannot modify that array directly, okay? So state variables cannot be modified as normal variables, because otherwise React will lose track of the modification, and so will not be able to update all the components below. So the only way to update a state variable is to call in the setting function. So resist from directly manipulating these answers. Just treat this state variable as constants. In the single execution of a function, in the single rendering of a React function, states cannot be modified. We can only schedule the modification for the future with a set function. Okay, so the idea is the delete answer function does not delete an element from the current state, but it will set a future state that will no longer contain that current element. Okay? So it's basically a filter operation. We are filtering out, we are creating a new array with all the same elements except the ones that match the ID. Okay? So this could be how to create, this looks like we are in the first week doing exercises on array. Okay? We are just the current set of answers, and we create a filter of them, and we retain all the answers for which the answer ID is different from the ID that we received as a parameter. Okay? And this should work, I hope. We are not able to test it right now because we need to be able to call this function by clicking on the button below. Just beware, we are still not finished here, because we are setting a state, the new value of a state, starting from the current value of the state. And this creates the problem that we saw last week, where if we have many operations going on in parallel, we are snapshotting the current state in a given time, and then we are setting the future value to a computation made on the previous state, while the state itself may have been changed in the meantime for other reasons. Okay, so the rule that we gave ourselves is whenever a new state depends on the old state, change it in a callback function and not with an expression directly. So actually, we don't compute the new state according for the current state, but we will ask to compute the new state according to the new value of the current state when the callback is executed. And this means that the argument of set answers is not just an expression, but will be a callback function that will compute the expression. So, I transform this into a callback function that starts from the previous answers and filters on those. So it's the same, but we are delaying, extracting the value. This argument, previous answer, is, let's say, the previous state from the point of view of the filter function. It's the future state from the point of view of this delete answer function. So I'm scheduling to delete an ID that will modify a state that might have changed before the callback will be executed. So I need, when the callback really runs, we need to take the latest snapshot of the state. So in many cases, or in all the cases where the future state depends on the current state, always do a set answers or set state function with a callback and not just with an expression. Okay, so this should be the right form, pending bugs, and we just need to let the button click call this function. I'm not giving the button itself direct control over the set answers function. I don't want to give away the direct control over all my state. I define the primitives, because maybe here I have some error checking, maybe I have some permission checking, not everybody can delete any question, any answer, or so on. So the component that owns the states also sets the rules for the legal modification of the state, and then gives away the keys for applying these rules. So we need to get a reference to this delete answers function down to the button that needs it. So we need to drill down every component. This is the boring part. Okay, so this delete answers, okay, the button that needs to call this is inside answers display. So I call a property, delete answer. So I add the property to this function. And so that answer display, the component, will receive this as a property, and in turn it can pass it back to answer row. Answer row, so we can have the delete answer by passing down the properties that it received. So it's a props dot delete answer. Okay, so in app, we take the actual function, delete answer is a local function, and we set it as a property. Then we take this property, prop.delete answer, and pass it down to my children, in this case, answer row that needs it. And so we can go inside answer row, and the property is needed inside answer action buttons. So delete answer, props dot delete answer. So every element gives it to their children. Finally, we get to the answer action buttons. where we have the actual button, and the delete button is here, and we could tell to this button that when the user clicks on it, it should call the delete function. So this can be done easily by setting an event handler. Okay, or event handler always start with the on. No, like we did with buttons. Okay, let's start on click. We call a function to delete the current ID. So we need to set up again a callback to call props dot delete answer with an argument which is the ID of the current answer. So does the answer action buttons know about the current answer? They should probably. Yes, they receive answer as a property here. So it could say, props dot answer WAR dot ID. So I'm using the answer object to extract the ID from the previous component, and I'm calling the function delete answer that came all the way along from up. Okay? And this should do the job. Just remember, we need a callback here, because this function, this part of function, must be executed on click. If we forgot this callback, so we just wrote this function here, the function will be run in the wrong moment. Well, we would be executing these delete answers when the component is rendering. Okay? When we call this function, we execute this, we'll delete it, and then the result of the on-click will be no longer a function, will be just an undefined. Okay? So remember, while we execute the function, we just need to compute and store away the event handler, not execute the body itself. So remember, we have a lot of delays of callbacks to set up there. So let's try to see and debug whether it's working. So right now, I try to click here, and it does. It works. It looks like working. And I delete the second one. Of course, everything is gone. If I reload the application, of course, by reloading the application, we reinitialize everything, and so the state will be reinitialized again from the fake variables. So let's try to delete the second one first. Yeah, okay. So this was the idea. Define state manipulation where the state is owned, and give the access to the state manipulation primitives. In this case, it was a delete, to the parts of the component tree that needs it. The same can be done. What other action we can do is to use the vote button, so to increasing a score. So delete was easy because we had an array. We just have to remove one element. We filter it out, and that's it. Increasing the score is a bit more complex, because we need to. So let's define another function. For example, upvote of a function with an answer with a given ID. Okay, so we receive the ID of a function, and we must increase the number of votes of that specific function. So that calls again for doing a set answers. We create a new state that is identical to the current one, except for one specific item where we need to modify one property of that item. So the idea here could be to rebuild another array where we copy all the elements from a previous array except one. They will be modified. So this can be done normally with a map operation. So we are mapping an array. We use map often to create an array of a type of object starting from another type of objects. In this case, we are using the map to recreate the same type of objects and take the chance of modifying some of them on the way. Okay? So again, we are setting something to set a state, a future state starting from the current state. So let's set up a callback for doing that. So previous answers. I never know whether to call this argument as a next state or previous state, because it depends on where, but I just want to use a name which is different from the state. Previous answers, let's use that. And we replace it with a copy of itself. Okay? So we could, the easy way could be just, okay, let's make a copy. Previous answers, map, any answer onto itself. This is an operation, okay? This would create an identical copy. We take the set of answers, for each of them we create a new object which is exactly the same. No? A is a specific answer in the list. We want to do this operation for all the answers except one, except the answer with a given ID, right? So what we could do here is to modify, if we want to do everything in one line. Otherwise, you can split the function in several statements, of course, but it's quite a normal behavior like this. We check whether the ID is different from ID, then we return the same element. Otherwise, so we are using the, so let's make it a little bigger, because every character counts here. So I'm saying, for each element, if the ID of this answer is not the one that we should vote, then return the same answer, unmodified. Otherwise, so I'm using the ternary operator here. Otherwise, we should return a new object which is similar to A, but with the score increased. So what I could do here is create an object which is a copy of A. So I'm using the spread for making a copy. But then I will redefine the score of A.score plus 1. Okay, so it's a lot of nesting here, right? This operation here is creating a new object identical to the current one, A, but with the score increased by 1. So I'm copying all the properties with the spread operator, and then I'm overwriting the score property that was maybe 0, and now I'm overwriting it with 1. Beware the order. First we need to copy the old ones and then override with the new ones. So if you swap them, it will be overwritten. Okay? And then we use this new value only when this condition is false, so when actually the ID is equal. So is the ID of the question that we really need to increase. And all this, the map will create a new array that will finally replace the answers. Okay, and actually these kind of patterns are very frequent. So every time we have to manage a state which is composed of an array, the basic operations are adding, removing, and modifying. Normally we are implementing something like this. Okay? Adding is also easier because we just need to make a copy and then add an element to the copy. and we will see it when we insert a new answer. So again, the upvote is defined here. I hope it works. We need to debug it, but first we need to call it. And for calling it, we need to go all the way down again to answers display. We set the upvote equal to upvote, sorry, inside the parentheses. And then we go inside the answers display and give this information also to answer row. So again, upvote equal to props.upvote. And then we have inside the answer row, you give it to the answer button, props.upvote. And inside the buttons component, we attach this action to the onClick of the up arrow icon. Again, callback props.upvote of props.a.id. Okay, let's see if it works. Save this, save that, check the browser. It doesn't, because props A is undefined in here. Ah, okay, because it's not A, it's sorry, it's answer. Okay, it's counting. So every time we click here, we are rebuilding the state. Everything else doesn't change, only this number, and of course the interface is exactly the same except for the number, and they continue to work. It's not difficult. We must really be clear about what are the modifications to the state that we want to support, and then give the handler to the component that needs to call the modification function with all the information that it needs, of course. Okay, so the ID can only be known by the button, because every button has is related to a different action. So that's a parameter that should come from down below. And so you see that we are calling this function in up at the top level by using an argument that comes from below, from the component calling it. So the reason I'm not calling the function here, because I must be down there to know the actual data, the actual value of the user. Okay, so this is for, say, simple operations. A predefined mutation, so increasing a score or deletion and so on. What's the next step? The next step would be to, for example, insert a new answer. Okay? Here I just put a note. We need to create a form for adding new answers. And so we have to learn how forms are handled in React. Okay? The bottom line is that we are creating something for collecting user information, and then we have a submit button that will call just a simple state management function. In up, let's say we will create something like const add answer that will receive an answer object and will do something with it. So it will be a set answers with it, okay, something like that. Okay, not set, well, with the set answer with the, we can also write it down. So it's easy. We can create a new list with the current elements plus 1. Okay, so it will be just a set answers from the previous again, At that point, I need to create a new array with the previous answers plus the current one. Oh, sorry, if we don't have to do any. With something like that. Yeah. We are just adding at the bottom. So a new array with a copy of the current elements plus at the end a new one. The trick is getting this object. Of course, this works if we don't have to do any check, any validation, any reordering or reshuffling of the question, so we just append at the bottom. No, that's the bare minimum. So, add answers. We need to be able to learn how to create a form. So let's have a look here. Add, sorry, not the presentation, the other one. At forms in React in JSX, how to create them, okay? Not how to create them, just creating them means using some input elements or some form control from Bootstrap, but how to manage the data inside, okay? React is a quite deep take over the reinterpretation of HTML elements from forms, because the HTML elements from forms are quite inconsistent. They behave in different ways. So a checkbox behaves in a different way from a drop-down select item, which is behaved differently, because they have different events, they have different properties for making them work. So what they did in React was to create a uniform way of seeing the different interactive elements. And actually, all the elements are managed by these two important attributes, and of course they may have some event handlers on them to check for modification, for insertion, and so on in the. So we have these two attributes which are defined uniformly over all the form elements. Value is the attribute that represents the current value of an element. So we have an input text. The current letters that have been written by the user can be accessed by the value attribute of this component, the input component. And on the other way around, if we set the value attribute of the component to a given string, that will be displayed. Okay? Default value is the initial value of the form. So when the component is created before the user types anything, we can set a default value for the creation time, and then before the user can modify that. So the important attribute here is value that we can use to write and read the content of the form. For example, in the input element, HTML already has an attribute called value. But in other components like text areas or drop-down list and so on, HTML behaves differently. It behaves with selected attributes, something like that. And in React, no. In React, we always use value. Okay, these are simplified version. And the same happens when we need to say check what the user is doing, and we have a onChange event that is defined on all the different input elements and that behaves consistently. So onChange will fire. So if we set an event handler on the onChange event, it will fire every time a user changes something inside your form. So it types a letter, it deletes a letter, it clicks on a checkbox, and so on. Okay, so we can have fine control over the user actions by registering onChange events over every element. We already saw the onClick event and so on, and other events behave in the same way. When we wrote the onClick handlers, just pick one, we have a callback that is called at that time, and it took no arguments. We didn't need any information from that, okay? Because we already know what we need to do. Actually, when we call an event handler, that event handler will be giving an argument, a parameter, which is an object of type event. And okay, it has some property. Events have some property, but the most important one is event.target. So we can have an argument here, so an event here, e, and inside the body we can use e.target. E.target will refer to the component who generated the event itself. Why is it useful? Because that component now holds, if the user is changing something, that component now holds a new value. So we can use or get the information about what value has been changed by event.target.value. Inside the event handler, we can read the value by event.target.value. And we'll use that, of course, to check what did the user type, okay? So this is always passed. In many cases, we don't need it when we are doing simple operations, but when we are doing some operations that need to know the value of the current input element, we can extract it by the target.value attribute. Okay, we have a set of possible events which are listed on the next page here. Say, depending on the type of component, it will generate many different types of of events that we can, just redefine, register. The important one for us are, of course, on-click, which is applicable for everything and especially for buttons, but also for any other part of the page, and on-change, which is used for managing the content of the forms, plus other. I put in boldface the one that probably we can use, for example, in submit. For the submit button, we want maybe to do some operation before the form is actually submitted to the server. In some cases, maybe for validation. So let's start with the on-change. But as we said, event handlers should be functions, okay? So either we define a callback function and we give the name of a function to the event handler. So in this case, handler is the name of a function. We should never call the handler, okay, inside the attribute, the on-click or on-change event, something like that, or what we normally do, like we did before, on-click, callback, call the function. Okay, this is particularly useful or mandatory if we need to pass some arguments. For A and B, also we need to build an expression here. So build an event handler that uses calls some function with some argument computed locally, computed when the callback is executed. If we didn't need to pass any arguments, like for example in this example here, okay, so we are creating something that calls a function with no specific arguments. So that could be replaced, this one, with the first one, just by giving the name of the function. Okay, this is the name of the function. If we just need to call the function, we don't need to provide any argument, we just provide the function itself. Actually, it's not really true, because in that case, one argument will be passed, which is the event name. But maybe the handler function itself doesn't expect it anymore. But these are the different methods. I would say the most frequent case is the last one, because very often we need to pass some values, and so we need to define a local callback there with those arguments. So this is the format we normally learn to write, even if there are simpler ways of doing that in special cases. Okay, so that's about event handlers. We already used that, so it's not a problem. The big issue is managing the state. I imagined one component that is empty, for example, and I called it add answer form. So a form where the user can type something for adding the answer. And while I'm typing, actually the content of the web page is updating. Right? I'm typing in an input box, so the content is updating. So the page is not static, it's changing in some way. So where is the information about this change stored? It can be stored inside the browser itself, so the input element itself remembers something, or it can be stored into a state variable in the React component. And these are two different ways, they're both valid, two different ways of managing forms. One is so-called control components, where React controls exactly what goes into the forms. And the second possibility is having uncontrolled components, where the browser is free to let the user modify, and React is only involved when the user clicks on the submit button. So there are two different methods of handling forms. Controlled and uncontrolled. We first learn the controlled forms element that gives us total control over what happens in the form, and in the second case we leave the browser do the handling with uncontrolled forms. The philosophy of control component is that the current value of every input element, every control, is always is always defined by the React state, by some React state variable. Let me make an example here. Imagine in this component that I just created, we want to add one. Let's make it easy just by using an input element. Input just the HTML tag, okay? So we may want to write, I don't know, answer or your text. We will make it nicer, but just for understanding the mechanism now, okay? We have an input element with a given name, maybe the text itself or the answer. And this will render something like this. Sorry, the browser is here. Will render an input element where the user can type. In this case, we call this component, this input, an uncontrolled element, because there's nowhere in the React application where the information about that string is available. Well, we don't have it. The browser has it. We can read it in some way, especially when the user submits, but for now, the user can type everything. Okay? Having a control component means having a state, a React state somewhere that officially registers the current value of this input element. So, for example, I could have a state variable here inside this component. I call it text, maybe. Text, use text, is a state. Maybe we initialize it with an empty string. Maybe. We need, of course, to import this. Use state from React, yeah. Okay. So we create a local state that we want to always be synchronized with the content of the input element. For synchronizing a state variable, which is here inside React, with the value of an input element which is there inside the browser, we need to set up a two-way link from the state to the input and from the user action to the state update. The first one is easy. We just set the value of this input element to the state. So whatever the state is, the form value will be forced. Okay, so in this case, we have a state which is initialized with an empty string, sorry. And yeah, it's empty. If we put something else in the initial state, it will be, of course, copy that into the component. Yes?
So here we cannot write something?
At the moment, we cannot write anything. If I try to write, it doesn't. Because the attribute is being of the component is being forced by React. Okay? This is the meaning of controlling the component. Of course, we want to let the user write something, and we can do that by handling the onChange event of that form. So, okay, when the user types something, a change event is change event is fired, and this change event contains an event with a new value that the user is trying to type. So at this point we could, yes?
Isn't it the change event? Yeah. So the user writes and the change event updates the state.
The change event, let's say, yeah, learns what the user is typing and then will update the state.
Isn't the change event called on every character type?
Yes, yes, at every keystroke.
Okay.
So we are putting a burden on React, of course, yes. Something that the browser is able to do by itself, by letting the user type. We are preventing the browser itself from doing that, and we are controlling it inside JavaScript. That's one philosophy, yes. But it allows us for doing something else, for example. Let me show. So on change, we take the event, which will be a change event, and we use the event.target.value to update the state. So set text, sorry, no, use text, was set text. Okay. So now the user is able to type. So we did a lot of work for nothing, or not really for nothing, because now we have a state variable here that is linked in real time with what the user is writing. Okay? And this information is inside some React state. What I did here is to create local state. This state variable is only local to this component that handles the form. It doesn't need to be visible by anybody else, probably. Okay, so this is a first idea of separating the state from application state, it contains the data, the question, the answer, from local component state, which is used for managing the interaction of part of the page. What is typing is maybe a section of the page open or hidden or something like that. Something that, some state information, of course, that is need to be retained, but is only interesting to a part of the page for handling the local interaction. What is the advantage of this? Well, for example, I could, this is just a brutal set text, but I could use a callback function that only allows me, I don't know, to enter capital letters, or we can decide where to use the set text or not, depending on some criteria. So we are actually filtering what the user can do. Or maybe we can just have say that we know, for example, text.length. We can update in real time what the user is I don't know, many forms, it tells you the minimum, maximum number of characters. We can already do some error checking, put some error value, because it's information that is available in the component, in the state, and so everything we render in this component always has the latest version, the current version of the text. So we can use this information not just for the input, but also for surrounding elements, maybe mark with an icon whether it's okay or not, or something like that. So validating, yeah, doing some, well, you are not really validating yet, because while the user is typing, of course, maybe if we have a minimum length, initially it's not valid. So we should not throw an error in the face of the user before he starts typing, okay? So we can give feedback whether it's okay, and then only when it submits, we will show an error message, so it's a different moment. No? But we can do any type of advanced operation. Or we could maybe prevent the user for entering, I don't know, numbers, or whether there's a maximum length, we can just prevent the updating. No? We can, okay, this is just the event handler, the crude event handler, but we could use, if we need to do something more sophisticated, we define a simple update text function with starting with the text that the user typed. No, not the text, call it in a different way, new text. And then we do what we want. For example, we say that if new text dot length is less than 10, then at this point we can set text to the new text. And instead of calling directly the set text, we call this function that can do some extra checks. In this case, it prevents writing more than 10 characters. So in this case, I'm writing something, but now it's stopping at 9, for example. Yeah, is less than 10, or maybe I want it to write less than or equal. And then I cannot type anymore. I can delete something and write something more, but okay, just example. Okay, just you get the mechanism. So we have some extra work to do, because for every input element we need to have a state that is tracking its value, and an updating function that may be just replacing the value to rebuilding it, but then or we are open to reuse the same value elsewhere in the component, or to do some extra checks about the user actions. This is also something that the browser could do. For example, in the input element in HTML, we have a max length property. So we are doing in our JavaScript code some validations that also the browser could do if we chose to use the component as uncontrolled component. So it's a choice. It's a two different ways of managing. Yes?
Because this is backend, we completely avoid cross-site injection. Sorry, an SQL injection or complete manipulation of the input, right? Because nobody can access the code that we write in there. So
No, this is running on the front end, on the browser. Yeah. So it's not this is, remember, in React we are managing the user interface. Okay, so it can all be manipulated. The real security is not in these checks. These checks are for usability, for user interaction, and not for real security. Okay, like I did here. Okay, I can change the state in the browser with just the inspector. So there's nothing special. There's no protection for that. Okay. The security will do. We need to do that when we interact with the real data, which is in the backend. So that is where the real. So there's not real security in the front end, because the code is just there. Okay, so that was the philosophy for control components. Means that for every component, we need also always to have two attributes set, the value for setting the value itself, and onChange for letting the value evolve. And onChange, in many cases, could be just a set function, or set function plus some other operations. We know that this function will be running at every keystroke. Okay. And this for typing. Different is when we want to submit the form. So we are actually two different types of events. One is okay, handling the single input element, and the other is okay, the user finished and wants to submit the whole form. And so submission is a different event from the change, which is the final one that is generated by a submit button usually. So these are the two main components. On the other hand, if we had or we want to go the way of uncontrolled components, it means that the React component itself doesn't know anything about the current value of the input elements. So when the user is typing, like I may have another element here that I make uncontrolled, maybe, I don't know, alternative. We have an input name equal to we just don't set the value element. If we don't set the value element, the input element becomes uncontrolled. So they look like similar, because in both cases I can type, cut and paste, whatever, but in the second case you see that what I wrote here is a mystery to React. Is inside the element, but the add answer form doesn't have any state, any variable for the. So, for example, if I wanted to write the number of characters here, I can't. Or I can't inside the React. At that point, I should set an event handler at the HTML level, but it sort of defeats the idea. What we could do is to, so if you want to do some validation, some maximum number, we should use the HTML attributes. For example, we have the max length, which is a property in HTML. We set it to 10. And so in this case, in theory, it's the browser, okay, which prevents me from going over the number of elements. So you see, there are totally two different ways of thinking. One is I control everything myself, and the other, I let the browser do its work by exploiting the mechanism, the validation or the checking mechanism that are defined by the browser itself. And but sooner or later, I must be able to know this value. And this will happen where? At the submit button. In this case, all the values will be transferred to React at submission time, because in the submit event, okay, the event.target will contain some data value that represents all the elements in the form, not just the single element, because the submission is for a whole form, not just for a single element. So the submission will pack together all the values and give them to the callback function. And at that point, we have the full set of elements that have been evolved by the user. So all the work will be, in this case, for uncontrolled component. You see, for control component, we use value and onChange. For uncontrolled component, we use the default value if you want to set something at the beginning, but that can be changed by the user, and on submit of the form, where we collect the data and we can use it to store it in some state or some backend API and so on. So we are maybe working on, today we're going to work on with, let's say, control state. okay, and see how they work. Uncontrolled state can be managed by hand, or, but I don't think we have time to see that today. In React 19, they invented a new hook, which is called use action state, which will help us managing the submission procedure and the validation at submit time. So this is particularly useful for uncontrolled forms. Okay, but let's first finish one way and then go the other way. So for today, let me see it. We are going to complete the exercise, okay, by using the controlled form strategy. Okay. So this means that we need to create one form, one HTML form, with all the information that is required, plus set all the event handlers for managing the component, plus setting one event handler to actually submit the form. And for submission, at submission time, we just need to call the function that we already defined in app that was called a new answer. Okay. So at the same time, we have a look. These are just bare HTML input elements. We are inside Bootstrap, so we can create nicer looking forms. So if you see the React Bootstrap pages, there's a whole section about forms with a lot of examples that will show us how to create forms with the input element, plus the labels, plus the tooltips at the bottom, and so on, all nicely formatted. Okay, so we can have forms that are vertically developed, so they take the full width of the page, and then they have the elements one below the other, or we can make them into some examples below, in forms layout. Yeah, the example how we can control the form, for example, in a grid way, so different elements like this, or even more complex grids. And what they are telling us is basically to use column and rows from row and column for the different elements. Okay, if you want to format them in some way, in some, say, packed way, instead of having everything, let's say. But the basic idea is that we have one element which is called form control. That is a common in React Bootstrap, if we are using the React Bootstrap library, okay? Otherwise, you can do whatever you want. Even basic HTML inputs are working. But otherwise, if we are using React Bootstrap, we should rely on the form control element, and which has a type attribute. In this case, type email, or type password, or type checkbox, and something like that. And the types define what is actually generated, and what are the validation rules. Okay. For example, email will already contain a little validation about the email addresses and so on. So, for example, in our case, instead of using input, we could use just form.control type equal to text, and probably leave everything else as it is. And what's the browser here? And here, okay, we see it. This is the input that has been changed in the layout because it's now being managed by Bootstrap. So you see the full row where the user can type something. And so instead of having the title up there and having the label besides, we can use the surrounding elements that the React Bootstrap tells us they are called forms.label and form.text, and we need to group them into a form.group element that tells Bootstrap which are the elements that are related to the specific input element. So this is just for the aesthetics. So I create a form.group, dot group group element that will wrap my input. So let's get rid of the alternative. And let's close it like that. And inside I have a label that contains the text, a control, which is the actual input element, and then I can have some notes for example here, which is the text, for example. We can call it like this. It's nice. Sorry. Copy, paste, and then we close the form group. No, we close it twice. So it takes some, yeah. Okay, so right, now we have the same as before. Let me maybe put a title over there. Just to, okay, separate what we are doing, okay, for example. So this, okay, apart from the using the bootstrap element for make it look nicer, the actual logic of the behavior is the same as before. We are setting value and on change, and so therefore this is a control component, okay. And we can repeat it for all the other information that we have. Okay, now I'm making a form. I could also put the different elements in column, one below the other, in the same columns here. But for example, the date, we don't need to let the browser enter a date, because when we submit the form, we can compute the current date right now. The user should not enter the date. The user should not enter the author name. We should already know who is the currently logged in user. Because otherwise I'm typing the username for anybody else, and it looks like he answered to my question. The score shouldn't be given by the user. We start from 0. So actually here we don't have any other information. The answer object requires a text, and everything else can be defined by the application itself. The date is from today, the score is 0, must be 0 initially, and the author should be known from the login information. We don't have login yet, but normally we do. Okay? Just for the sake of exercise, let's put the author as a second field, okay? Just to see how a form with more than one field looks like. But we know that we need to remove it because the application should already know it. And this means that we just have to add a second group. In this case, we say the email, your email. Let's say type email, so that it does some validation. Name equal to email, value email. On change, update, not update text, but update email. And this can be removed, we don't need it. And of course, we need to create a second const email, set email. To another and so it was not update email but was set email. Okay, so that these are two different and independent fields that should be filled by the user. Okay, And now we can submit the form itself. So we can have the submit button. Let's take away again the example for the forms. For example, here it's giving this information, this example. Okay, if you see, I'm just picking the first example for the overview, the simplest one. So we can add a submission button here and add answer. Type submit. How does the button know which are, we may have many control in the same page for different forms in the same page. How can the button know which are the forms that are related to this specific submission? It knows because we need to group everything into a big form container. So form doesn't do anything by itself, it only groups the elements that are its children. And so this is looking like this. The text that the user is typing, the email, they are both available in this component state. Answers display, no, answer, sorry, below. Answers form, we have these two states, one for the text of the response and the other for the email of the author. And then we have the submission button here. Let's put the indentation okay. We have a submission button that will we need then to associate to some action. We need to call the, at the end we need to call the add answer, sorry, the add answer function with a properly built answer object. Okay, so we first build the object by checking whether it's correct or not, and then we call the function. So we add inside this button, we can register the submission event. The submit event is generated at the form level, not at the level of a single control. Okay, and it is triggered when we click on the submit button, and in some cases also when we type enter. When we only have one field, it will automatically submit the element. These are HTML rules, and it will trigger the submit event for the form. And we just need to provide a function const to submit answer. And we decide what should happen at the submission time. Okay? So what we can see is what happens here, console.log e.target. So at the submission time, we receive an event just to see if it's working. So, okay, we are here, we are typing something, add answer. Did I save it? Sorry. Submit answer, form on submit, submit answer, okay. Okay, so this is the problem. Okay, when I click here, you see that what's happening, the page refreshes, because actually the browser is doing what I asked it to do, to submit the form. Submit to the server, okay? Usually when you have an HTML form, it will call the action URI by sending the data. Actually, we don't want to do that, because we want to process the data ourselves before possibly sending it to the server. So what we need to do as soon as possible is to say to the server, don't do your own work on the event. So the submit event usually by default should call to send the data to a server. Don't do that, okay? Don't process the event anymore, so that this, okay? When I click here, we see that it doesn't flash anymore, and it prints this form.class. What is the form.class? It's the target of the source actually of the event, which is the form to which the event handler is attached, okay? And so there was this event.target, in this case is the form. We could query the form by asking for the different, for example, text. If I remember well, the form is populated with all the properties. You see the text refers to the input element called name equal to text, and I see it here. If I want to extract the actual value, I could just write value here. So in this case, it prints, you see, DDD, the current text that was typed. So on the submission event, I have access to the current values of all the elements. This is basically necessary for the uncontrolled behavior of the form. In the controlled behavior of the form, we don't actually need to check this, because the text is already available here. You see that we already know before what is the current value of the text, because actually we set it by forcing the text. So actually you see that when I submit, I always have the same value in the two ways. One is I already know it because I'm controlling the elements, so the state already tells me what I need to know. In the other case is I don't know for some reason because I didn't control the form, and so I can extract the value in this moment from the form itself. Okay, so there are the two ways. This is for uncontrolled. If the form was uncontrolled, I read at submission time, and if the form is controlled, I already known. And the prevent default is for avoiding the application to reload. Reloading means also losing all the state. Okay, so since we are right now, we have built a controlled state, we can simply use the information for creating a new object. So the new answer will be a new answer object. From our models, remember we already have to import the constructor function, and the constructor function requires an ID, which is a problem, a text, an email, the user ID, date, score, and so on. So some of this information can be available right now from the user interface. Some will only be available at the model level. So when everything, well, the database basically level. Okay. Let's fake it. So the ID, I don't know it, undefined. The text, the second argument is the text, we can use text. The third argument is the email, The user ID is unknown, so undefined. The date is today's date. as a string, if I remember correctly, or I never remember whether it's a string or it's a string because it calls the JS by itself. So to make a string, I need to use .js and then format, mean for extracting today. Day, yeah. Dot format year, month, day. And then the last argument is the score, which is of course 0. So I have some data which I already know. I create the object with information I know. Some data I cannot know because it will be set later on by the database, by the insertion, and so on. So I leave it there, and some at the later stage it will be filled on. Okay. So, but let's try to, at this point, imagine we are doing all the checks, whether the image is correct, the text is correct, and so on. Okay, all the validation. And if validations are okay, we can actually add it. How? With props dot add answer. And prop dot add answer needs to be passed down out to this level. So add answer, and now we have the long and the boring part. In answer display will pass it down to answer row. Props dot add answer. Answer row will pass it down to answer, no, row data, action, but no, sorry, answer row doesn't need it because the answer form that needs it. Add answer. Let's remove it from here and put it into answer form. So it doesn't go to the buttons, it goes to the form below. And add answer form at this point is using it. So let's see what happens if it doesn't break, and then we can have a break ourselves. So text, mail, add answer. In this case, you see, I try to click on add answer, and I'm getting a warning from the browser itself because I set type equal to email, and so the browser is doing some submission time validation even before calling the onSubmit event. So, okay, I'm right. And it didn't work. Because the text here didn't change. But I would say that, so the idea is, okay, this text, just me one check, then we debug after the break. So the callback is called, where am I? Inside answers. The callback is called because it's printing this stuff. Let's comment it, but let's keep it for a moment because we are debugging. And then we are, sorry, I didn't actually call the function. Okay. I didn't complete right in the, okay. So actually I wrote something and it added a new element to the list. Now I have some warnings, of course, basically because I don't have the key for the new element because the key is derived from the ID and the ID is undefined for me. Okay, something that we can fix. Okay, so this is the basic for forms and adding. We make a break and then we think about the most complex, where we polish it a bit, okay, and then we think about the most complex operation, which is editing, which is a combination of reading, modifying, saving, and so on. Okay? So let's break for 15 minutes.